I'm going to start off in 6:10 to 6:20. We already kind of alluded to 6:1 through 9. So essentially, this is the concluding exhortations, and it's to continue by the Spirit's help against in warfare against the powers that I mentioned earlier is apparent throughout this letter. So Paul urges them, in light of all that's been said in the letter this far, up until this point, to contend against the powers by means of the armor provided through the redemption of Christ. This is in verses 13 through 17. And then the weapons of the Spirit, which is verses 17 through 20, which is the Word of God and prayer. So this final exhortation has two parts. Verses 10 through 12 basically sets out the basic imperatives. First of all, that they might be empowered by the Lord in verse 10, and that they put on God's armor so as to withstand the devil, verse 11. And the reason for these imperatives is because of this ongoing war against the powers. Now, verses 13 through 17 basically repeats the second imperative and then spells out the nature of the equipment, which consists of the armor of Christ to withstand their attacks and the weapons of the Spirit so as to take them on. So that's the offensive. Now, the various aspects of the gospel are associated with the forms of armor, all of which are for our defense. So if you notice, all of these are different aspects of the gospel. So the truth is a belt, righteousness is a breastplate, the gospel of peace is shoes, faith is a shield, and salvation is a helmet. The final piece of equipment is a soldier's weapon, which is his sword. That's the offensive weapon, which is associated with the Spirit and further identified as the Word of God. So the interesting thing about this, the Word of God, is it probably, based off of how Paul typically uses the Word of God, this probably means the message of the gospel. So the mention of the sword of the Spirit in verse 17 evokes the further concern that they pray in the Spirit, which then is elaborated in verses 18 through 20. So this indicates a crucial role the Spirit plays in our continuing warfare against Satan. Not only are we to be clothed with the armor that Christ provides in the gospel, but we're to take the enemy on by Spirit-empowered proclamation of the gospel and by Spirit-empowered praying. And just to conclude, so the net result, talking about the letter as a whole, this is obviously one of the truly great moments in the New Testament. This is the one profound elaboration of the cosmic and universal scope of Paul's gospel and the place of the church in God's ultimate design. God's victory over the powers on our behalf through Christ reconciling us to himself and to one another and empowering us by the Spirit to live in that victory. And it's a Trinitarian tract of the highest order, which is that God wills it, Christ effects it in history, and the Spirit appropriates it in our lives, in our ongoing daily lives. And that's all I have to say about that.
That's a lot, though.